This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 544 of the Late Round Podcast, on many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. FanDuel is giving new users an exclusive offer to play NFL Daily Fantasy for free all season long. All you have to do is sign up for FanDuel Daily Fantasy, and you'll receive one free voucher for each remaining week of the NFL season. You'll receive your voucher upon sign up to FanDuel Daily Fantasy, and vouchers will automatically apply to each weekly entry. Head over to FanDuel.com and sign up to play Daily Fantasy Football. Eligibility restrictions apply, new users only. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. It's 15 transactions a day, so let's get to these transactions. Hold or buy Ezekiel Elliott. So in the NFL's opening night, Ezekiel Elliott did not look very good. He didn't produce all that well. He ran for just 33 yards, he had 11 carries, and he only added 2 catches through the air. You were hoping for way more out of a first-round pick. The good news is there were some positives. Elliott had 78.6% of the team's running back rushes. That's right in line with his 2020 average of 73.5% per game. And it wasn't far off from his 2019 share too. That was 80%. And we have to keep the opponent in mind as well. Tampa Bay is arguably the toughest opponent that any running back can face in the NFL. They were top 5 in the league last year in adjusted fantasy points allowed. And upcoming for the Cowboys is a much, much better schedule. We obviously want positive game scripts for Zeke to thrive. And from week 2 through the middle of November, this week's game against the Chargers might be the only time that the Cowboys are underdogs. That's how easy the schedule is. And LA is only favored by 2.5 points this weekend, according to FanDuel Sportsbook. So why not go all in? Why not go out and just buy Zeke everywhere? Well, there is some concern over his receiving numbers. Even though he ran a solid 44 routes according to Pro Football Focus, we can't overlook the fact that Zeke only had a 3.5% target share in that game against Tampa Bay. That was the lowest that he's seen since 2019, and it was the 4th lowest in a single game that he's had across his entire career. The hope is that that was sort of due to matchup. But the Cowboys were also manufacturing touches for Tony Pollard. Pollard ended up seeing more targets than Ezekiel Elliott did against the Bucs. He had 4, Zeke had 2. So I think that we should treat Zeke as an RB1, but no longer a mid-range RB1, more of a lower-end one. So if you can get him cheaper for that, which you might be able to after his week 1 performance, then go for it. Add Cedric Wilson. So in that same game against the Buccaneers, Michael Gallup, who looked really good in that game, he ended up getting hurt. He's going to be out 3 to 5 weeks. And the player who's going to benefit the most in this Cowboys offense is probably Cedric Wilson. He played the 4th most snaps on that team at wide receiver in that game. Now, in most cases, a team's number 3 wide receiver wouldn't be that big of a deal for fantasy football purposes. But in Dallas's case, it's a little bit different. They've been a very pass-heavy team over the last year plus with Dak Prescott under center. And that was very evident in week 1. No team had more targets overall than the Dallas Cowboys. So Cedric Wilson could be relevant. Sell Robby Anderson. The Carolina Panthers offense is a lot different this year than it was last year. You now have Sam Darnold under center, Christian McCaffrey's back, Curtis Samuel's gone, and then rookie Terrace Marshall is there. It seemed like Robby Anderson would still have a pretty steady role in this Carolina offense, even with all these changes. But in week 1, we didn't see that. He did find the end zone on a 57-yard reception, but that was his only catch of the game. He finished with just 3 targets and a target share below 10%. And he's a sell candidate this week, because clearly I think this is sort of time to panic. Anderson's allure a season ago was his reliability. His lowest target share in a single game last year was 14.7%. He was well below that mark in just week 1. And again, it was with all these changes in the Carolina offense. Now, don't get me wrong. I would expect Anderson to see more looks moving forward. And that's especially true because he still tied DJ Moore for the team lead in wide receiver snaps. He played 19 more snaps than Terrace Marshall. My issue is I think we might end up seeing more variance week to week with Robby Anderson's target share. And we just can't bank on a 57-yard touchdown happening every week. And because that play happened, you may be able to sell Robby Anderson for a wide receiver 3 price tag still. add Elijah Mitchell. So let's talk about what happened with San Francisco this weekend. I've been analyzing fantasy football for about a decade now. I've been playing the game since the early 2000s. I cannot remember a more surprising out-of-nowhere week 1 inactive than what we saw with Trey Sermon this past Sunday. And maybe that's a slight exaggeration. It just feels like that's the case. Trey Sermon played with the starters in the preseason. He ran well, and there weren't any major reports of him being behind both Elijah Mitchell and JaMychal Hasty on that depth chart. Then out of the blue, he's inactive. Now, this is going to be a shameless plug, but every Sunday at noon on FanDuel's YouTube channel, I do a start-sit show. On that show this week, I made reference to Elijah Mitchell being my favorite ad off the waiver wire between himself and JaMychal Hasty. And this was after the Trey Sermon news had dropped. And the reason is because Mitchell was sort of a Raheem Mostert clone. He's 5'10", he's 201 pounds, when Mostert's NFL measurables are 5'10", 205 pounds. Elijah Mitchell ran a 4.3 540 at his pro day. Mostert ran a 4.3 440 at the combine. Neither player had amazing college production, but because of their speed, they were incredibly efficient. Kyle Shanahan has a type. And with Mostert going down early in week 1 against Detroit, Mostert 2.0 stepped in and he ran the ball 19 times for 104 yards and a touchdown. Now, there was a positive script for San Francisco, and Elijah Mitchell didn't see a target partially as a result of that. But he did have over 86% of the team's running back rushes. And now Raheem Mostert is out for an extended period of time. So that's good news for Elijah Mitchell. Now, here's the thing. Don't go dropping Trey Sermon. He's going to be active now. So this backfield could still be somewhat of a mess. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't go out and still add Elijah Mitchell. Because who knows, he may really end up being the 1A in this offense. Add Kenneth Gainwell. So yeah, I'm going to take a big L on Boston Scott in that recommendation last week. But I will say the process clearly wasn't that bad. Because instead of Boston Scott being the guy that I thought was going to play that role, it ended up being Kenneth Gainwell in that Philadelphia backfield. I just didn't think that we were going to see Gainwell so fast. But I like Gainwell the prospect. I think that Gainwell's a better running back than Boston Scott. I was just predicting how they were going to use those running backs right away and early in the season. And I was wrong. Gainwell got run a lot earlier than I thought. He's going to play the pass-catching role in this Eagles offense. And it makes sense because he was a good receiver in college. Among relevant backs in this year's draft class, he had the highest best season reception share. Philadelphia had a positive game script against Atlanta. And that's even more reason, though, to be bullish on Gainwell. He finished the game with a 9.4% target share, and he had 37.5% of the running back rushes in that backfield. That turned into 9 carries and 3 targets. If and when the Eagles are in a worse game script, Gainwell could really benefit. So he has some flex appeal, but he also has handcuff appeal as well. Sell Melvin Gordon. So Melvin Gordon gave us a top 10 running back performance this week. And that was even with rookie Javonte Williams in the mix. And by in the mix, I mean that backfield was completely split in half. Both players played 33 snaps. Williams out-attempted Gordon 14-11. But Gordon saw 3 targets to Williams 1. The difference in fantasy football came down to a 70-yard touchdown from Melvin Gordon, period. Now, I should add that Gordon was the better runner in that game against the Giants. According to NumberFire's expected points model, Gordon had a 45.5% success rate, or the percentage of runs that went for positive expected points. That was far better than Williams' 21.4% rate. But I'm still selling Melvin Gordon, because there's a higher likelihood that the rookie that Denver traded up in the second round for, the one who ranked as a 92nd percentile prospect in my model, that he ends up taking over the backfield this season versus the veteran, versus the alternative. And because Gordon had a big day in fantasy, you might be able to sell high. Add Carlos Hyde. This is what I've been talking about all offseason. I don't think Urban Meyer and this staff, I don't think they're very sharp. Look at everything they've done up until this point. They draft Travis Etienne in the first round despite being a rebuilding team. You don't do that. They signed Tim Tebow. They introduced that circus. They acted like Gardner Minshew had a shot to beat Trevor Lawrence for the QB1 job just to trade him for a meaningless draft pick. And then Sunday happened. You have James Robinson, who was great last year as an undrafted rookie, and you're going to let Carlos Hyde dig into James Robinson's role? I mean, look, Robinson isn't Christian McCaffrey, but he's still pretty good. It's a crime that James Robinson lost that much work to Carlos Hyde this past week. Hyde out-attempted James Robinson 9-5. So because of that, sure, I guess we're adding Carlos Hyde this week. Clearly, I'm not that excited about it, but we have to do it because Urban Meyer is doing these crazy things. Here's the thing, though. Jacksonville was in a negative game script for the majority of that game against Houston, which is crazy to begin with. If they couldn't come close to getting it done against the Texans, what's that say about how they're going to perform against other teams in the league? That means we're going to see a lot of negative game scripts, which means we're going to see more James Robinson than Carlos Hyde. Because in that game, Robinson saw 6 targets to Hyde's 2. And he also played more snaps. Now, I know I'm pooping on Carlos Hyde right now, but he's still worth an add because running backs are scarce. It's tough to have running backs who are getting volume. And we can't think rationally when it comes to this Jacksonville offense. Add Marquez Valdez-Scantling. So week 1 was one to forget for Green Bay. They didn't find the end zone. Aaron Rodgers posted the lowest fantasy total of his career. So naturally, when we're going to add a player like MVS, we're not doing it because he had great production. We're doing it for the peripherals. MVS only had 3 catches for 17 yards on Sunday, but he saw about a 22% target share in that offense, and he ended up being top 20 in air yards across the league. And all of those targets came from Aaron Rodgers. They weren't using MVS in garbage time when Jordan Love stepped into the game. When the Packers offense inevitably starts clicking, probably this weekend against Detroit, MVS could really benefit. Buy Najee Harris. So look, the situation for Harris is not all butterflies and rainbows. The Steelers did not look good offensively in week 1. And because of that ineffectiveness, they only ran 55 offensive plays. And that offensive line was just as bad as advertised. In Harris's first game in the NFL, he had only 45 rushing yards on 16 carries. But let's focus on the positives here. The Steelers should see more plays run because they averaged over 65 last year. Let's just assume they see a little bit more volume. That's a plus. But more importantly, Harris's peripheral numbers were actually amazing. We knew that he was going to own the Pittsburgh backfield, and he did that. He played every single offensive snap and saw every single running back rush in that week 1 game against Buffalo. And his 9.4% target share is pretty good too. Yes, the Pittsburgh offensive line is not good. And yes, the offense in general is probably not going to be very good this season either. But we want volume in fantasy football. Remember what I talked about in the preseason. Among the 39 running backs since 2011 with at least a 70% running back rush share and a 10% target share, 33 of them finished with 17 or more PPR points per game. Just be patient with Najee Harris. Add Tim Patrick. So as most of you know, Jerry Jeudy, he has a high ankle sprain. He's going to be out 4 to 6 weeks. Not great. But that is going to allow Tim Patrick to get more run in this offense. He played the second most snaps at wide receiver for the Broncos in week 1 against the Giants, and he has a history of being a fairly productive wide receiver. He was sort of like this unsung hero in fantasy football last year off the waiver wire. He averaged a 17.2% target share per game to go along with a 10.7 PPR points per game average. And the offense this year looks like it's going to be a little bit more efficient than it was last year. So if he can maintain that type of target share with Jerry Jeudy sidelined, he could have flex appeal in deeper formats. Add Jared Cook. Most of you need tight end help in fantasy football, and Jared Cook is available in about 3/4 of Yahoo leagues. So you can go after him, because in week 1, he was a top 10 tight end in routes run, and he finished that game with a 17.4% target share. That was also a top 10 number at the position. He has a good quarterback throwing him the ball. I think he has a genuine shot to be a tight end 1 this season. Buy Kyle Pitts. Now, if you want to go for a higher upside tight end, you could go after Kyle Pitts. He had a pretty mediocre performance in week 1. He had 4 catches, 31 yards. Not great. But the usage was there. According to Pro Football Focus, he was top 10 in routes run at tight end, and he lined up in the slot on over half of his snaps, ranking in the top 15 within that category. He also was out wide on 27% of his snaps, a number that ranked in the top 10 at tight end. And he was targeted a good bit too. He finished the day with 8 targets, which gave him a 24.2% target share. Through Sunday's games, only Adam Troutman had a higher week 1 share at the tight end position. So sure, it wasn't the best outing in the world for the rookie tight end, but there was a lot to like from a fantasy perspective. add Mark Ingram. I guess we're adding Mark Ingram this week. Ingram's usage was somewhat of a surprise for two reasons. The first reason was that he was by far the best early down runner for Houston on Sunday. He had over 70% of the team's running back rushes. But also, who saw this result coming? Houston played with a positive game script, so they were able to feed their running backs. So not only was Ingram's backfield share impressive, but because the Texans weren't completely incompetent offensively, he ended the day with the second most carries across the league on Sunday. Only Joe Mixon had more. But yeah, it does feel a little bit fluky. Are the Texans likely going to be leading in games the way that they were in week 1? Probably not. I would be shocked if they were. And that's going to hurt Ingram in fantasy because David Johnson had a 12.5% target share in week 1. Mark Ingram's was 3.1%. When they're in those negative game scripts, David Johnson is going to be the running back that you want. But regardless, I think that you can add Mark Ingram because he saw lots and lots of volume in week 1. Add Teddy Bridgewater. So I thought I was going to talk about Jameis Winston being the top streamer this week, and then I looked over on Yahoo and he was already rostered in 44% of leagues. But regardless, I think Teddy Bridgewater just might be the better week 2 streaming option. The Broncos are in Jacksonville this week. According to FanDuel Sportsbook, they're 6-point favorites in a game with a 45.5 point over-under. That gives them a high implied team total of almost 26 points. And this makes a lot of sense too. According to Sharp Football Analysis' Rich Rebar, Jacksonville has allowed 24 or more points in 16 straight games. That's the longest streak ever. Jacksonville's defense was atrocious in week 1. Tyrod Taylor actually had the third highest passing total of his entire career here in week 1. Even without Jerry Jeudy in that offense, Bridgewater has enough passing weapons to take advantage of this really good matchup. Add or hold the Green Bay Packers defense. So let's talk about L's last week. I liked the Packers defense as a streamer. That was clearly a terrible call. It was a big, big whiff. They were torched by Jameis Winston and the Saints. But this week, I'm expecting a different outcome. The Packers are going to face the Lions and they're in Green Bay. According to FanDuel Sportsbook, the Packers are 11.5 point favorites. That could cause the Lions to be pass heavy like they were in week 1 against San Francisco. And even though the 49ers surrendered a lot of points, they were able to sack Jared Goff 3 times and they also had a pick 6. This is not a scary offense. So if you had the Packers in week 1, hold on to them. If you didn't have them, you can still add them because they're available in almost 80% of Yahoo leagues. The 16th transaction this week that you can't get in my 15 transactions column over on numberfire.com is to add some tight ends. Seriously, there are a lot of tight ends out there who had decent usage that you may want to roster depending on your tight end situation. But there are 4 who stand out to me. They're Adam Troutman, Dalton Schultz, Tyler Conklin, and James O'Shaughnessy. Some may be confused as to why I'm advocating for Troutman and not Juwan Johnson, because Juwan Johnson scored twice. And it's because Adam Troutman saw a 30% target share in that Saints offense in week 1. He had twice as many targets as Johnson had, and he ran twice as many routes. Johnson's going to be a red zone threat, but it's not like Troutman can't score. It's not like he'll never be targeted in the red zone, so he's still a good option. Tyler Conklin ran as the top tight end for the Vikings. He had 32 routes run according to Pro Football Focus. Chris Herndon had 7. Conklin only had an 8.5% target share, but the routes run number is at least a positive. Dalton Schultz and Blake Jarwin really had similar peripherals with a slight edge to Schultz. With the offense now missing Michael Gallup and the fact that it's pass heavy, I think that Schultz is a really good add. And then finally, there's James O'Shaughnessy. Like I said earlier, Jacksonville's probably going to face a lot of negative game scripts this year. That means they'll be forced to throw. In week 1, O'Shaughnessy saw 8 targets and had a 16% target share. Because the Jags were so pass heavy, O'Shaughnessy ran the second most routes at tight end through Sunday's games. The peripherals are at least there for him. And that situation, because of those negative scripts, it's not all that bad. He can walk into some volume. So those are the 4 options to choose from. I'd say that Schultz is the most attractive given the quarterback and the situation that he's in. Troutman's probably number 2, then O'Shaughnessy, and then Conklin. And by the way, one more thing before I let you guys go. I mentioned some wide receivers on today's show that have very, very low percent rostered numbers over on Yahoo. I did that because I wanted to give everyone an opportunity to grab those lower rostered players. You're going to have a better chance of getting those guys. But if someone like Sterling Shepard is available on your waiver wire, I would take him over the wide receivers that I talked about. Nelson Aguilar probably too. So I want to just throw that out there before I let you guys go. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the Weekly 10 Trend Show.